Here we go.
There we go.
Excellent. Without Chris, I wouldn't be able to do this here. So thank you so much for helping me, Chris. Chris is our producer of today's webinar. So let me see if I can actually advance the slides. I talked already a little bit about me. I mentioned that we will have wonderful panelists later on. Nan Q will join us from the Scripps Research Institute. Raven Malatesta will join us from Georgia Tech. And Danielle Maxwell will join us from the University of Michigan. In general, if you have any questions throughout the presentation and of course our panel discussion, feel free to submit your questions via chat. I will share an overview of NSF GRFP and give you some tips and tricks. And then we will hear some stories and recommendations from recent GRFP awardees and try to answer as many questions as possible that you will submit via chat. So it is important to really think about the main goal of the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship program. The overall goal of this fellowship program is really to recruit individuals into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which of course includes the chemical sciences, chemistry, and chemical engineering. There are two specific goals though, right? The first specific goal is to select and recognize and financially support individuals who have demonstrated the potential to be high-achieving scientists and engineers early in their careers. Early in their careers, that means individuals that have received or will receive very shortly their undergraduate degree, or they are in the first or second year of their graduate program. The second goal is to broaden participation in science and engineering of underrepresented groups, including women, minorities, persons with disabilities, and veterans. So keep that in mind as you listen to our presentation and to the panel discussion. Two main goals for the NSF GRFP. And in general, there are three main reasons why you might want to apply for the NSF GRFP. If everything goes well, you might get a fellowship. And what does that mean? Well, you will get $138,000 over 5 years as a GRFP awardee. This fellowship doesn't go to your advisor or to an institution. The individual applicant, the awardee, will receive the fellowship. You, as a fellow, will receive the financial support. You will be very flexible. You can choose which project you would like to work on. You could choose your advisor. You could choose your graduate program. And there's no service requirement attached. So this is super flexible. And if after 1 or 2 years you decide, well, I started my graduate experience at University X, but I feel I would like to move to a different institution, you could take your fellowship and continue your graduate work at a different institution, as long as you work on a research-based master's or doctoral degree. In 2021, out of those approximately 2,000 fellowships that were given by the National Science Foundation, 279 fellowships were awarded alone in the chemical sciences. What is that for a percentage? It's probably around 11–12% of all fellowships went to the chemical sciences, which is pretty remarkable. So the second reason why you should think applying for GRFP is that even if you don't get funding, you might receive an honorable mention, which is given to meritorious applicants who do not receive the fellowship awards, but this is really considered a significant national academic achievement and does really well on your CV. Whenever you apply for a program, for a job, for a postdoctoral position, this will stand out, this recognition, and is very, very important. In 2021, sorry, I used the wrong year here. In 2021, 295 honorable mentions were issued in the chemical sciences. The third reason why you should think about applying for NSF GRFP is, well, you will get the benefit of experiencing the GRFP application process. You will learn about yourself. You will develop a cohort of reference letter writers. You will think deeply about what drives you, what motivates you, what are your strengths, what are your values. During the process of crafting the GRFP application, you have already the framework for a general graduate school application. You will really work hard on refining your grant writing skills in general. And you will also explore potential careers. And keep in mind, NSF GRFP is not necessarily given to individuals that envision to become a professor, right? It's there to support promising individuals that will have a societal impact later on. So overall, the third reason is about individual development. The most important piece of advice I can give you is to download the NSF GRFP solicitation. This is a document which really outlines the most recent framework for how to apply. The last solicitation was issued in summer 2020. I believe you should definitely check in June, July for an updated document. There will be very likely an updated solicitation this summer. And to be on top of that, make sure that you visit the nsfgrfp.org website regularly. Today, I will touch briefly on things to consider exploring that solicitation, including the deadlines, things to consider as you apply, as you prepare your application, and we'll talk a little bit about review criteria of the whole application. One thing what you will notice is that the submission deadlines are attached to the field of studies. And you see here listed all the high-level field of studies which are acknowledged in the NSF GRFP. This includes chemistry, computer and information sciences, engineering, up to STEM education. Those field of studies where students engaged in ACS type of research would do research are highlighted with a little ACS logo. So chemistry, engineering, geosciences, life sciences, materials research, STEM education. And as you think about your specific field of study, keep in mind, if you choose, for example, engineering for chemical engineering or chemistry, reviewers from that field will look at your application. So by choosing your field of study, you're choosing your reviewers, and it determines the deadline. Chemistry has several other subfields of study, and you will be asked for marking those subfields. Which one corresponds mostly to the research statement you will craft for this GRFP application. In chemistry, you will notice there's a subfield called artificial intelligence, chemical catalysis, chemical synthesis, environmental chemical systems, up to quantum information science and sustainable chemistry. You will have to make a choice. So think about the specific subfield of study carefully. I mentioned the overarching field of study, engineering. The ACS subfield would be chemical engineering and geosciences, biogeochemistry, for example, or geochemistry. In life sciences, there's biochemistry, chemistry of materials, and of course, STEM education and learning would include chemical education. And again, the field of study is important. It determines the deadline and actually who reviews your application. There are 5 main components for a GRFP application. First, I would call it more the background information, personal information about you, right? About your educational background, your work and research experiences, the proposed field of study, as we just discussed. You will list some honors, some awards, and your publications, right? Whenever you talk about, for example, about your honors and awards, make sure that you elaborate a little bit about those honors and awards, because the reviewers might not be aware what that actually means, right? If you have an award, you were selected as the only person out of a pool of 100 applicants and you got $10,000 for that award, write it down explicitly. Explain what this award and that honor is. Publications. You might or might not have a peer-reviewed research article as a publication. This would be great, but it's not necessary, right, to have a publication. Keep that in mind. Research experiences might be necessary, but they don't have to yield in a publication. But if you have research experiences, write about them in your personal statement. Make sure that the reference letter writers explain what you did in your research experiences and how you contributed to those. Publications, again, peer-reviewed research articles could be one thing, but also if you're interested in sharing, or if you have shared blogs or articles in non-peer-reviewed university journals or so, those count as well. Those are indications for broader impacts, and I will touch on broader impacts a little bit later on, right? So the first component for the GRFP application is more about you, about the broader background of you. Another important component is the personal statement with relevant background and future goals. This is a 3-page PDF. So why are you actually interested in getting a research-based graduate degree? What motivates you? What is your, right now, your long-term career goal? Again, it doesn't have to be a professor, right? It could be a science communicator or anything like that, would really indicate why NSF should actually provide you this fellowship. It could talk about many other experiences you had, for example, in the broader impact field. If you have made contributions to a local science communication club, if you have worked with high school students or with middle school students, did some kind of outreach activity, that could all go into the personal statement. The third component is the graduate research statement, which is a 2-page PDF. It's not a research proposal, it's a research statement, and it has one goal: to tell the reviewers that you're actually capable of articulating a scientific hypothesis and that you have thought about this hypothesis, how you would like to address this hypothesis in a research project. NSF will not require you to do exactly that research that you have proposed. However, NSF will require that you do later on research in that general area. Let's say chemical catalysis. That would be a requirement to do any kind of research in the chemical catalysis area. Fourth component, the transcripts, they're very important. And the fifth component are the letters of reference. 2 will be mandatory, 3 are recommended, and they're very, very critical. I will talk about them a little bit later on. So far, you know that you have to go to nsfgrfp.org to download the solicitation to check if there is an updated version available, maybe very soon and during summer 2021. But until then, make sure that you think about what is really special, what is unique, what is distinctive or impressive about you and your story, your narrative. What details of your life might help the reviewers better understand you or set you apart from other applicants? And also important, how did you get motivated to do research in that specific field that you're proposing to engage in? How have you learned about this field? Through classes, reading, seminars, work, or other experiences or conversations? How have you capitalized on opportunities available to you? And NSF knows exactly, and the reviewers as well, that depending on where you are, there might be more opportunities or there might be just a small number of opportunities, and that will be taken into account as the reviewers look at your application package holistically. And again, what reasons can you give for reviewers to be interested in you? What reasons can you give the reviewers to recommend that NSF and actually the taxpayers spend money to support you to make significant societal contributions later on as a professional? Your whole application package, those 5 components, will be reviewed using 2 criteria: intellectual merit and broad impacts. And if you stay in your STEM discipline later on, and if you apply for NSF funding, those 2 review criteria will be with you until you retire. NSF will use those 2 review criteria for every kind of fellowship application, grant proposal, etc., intellectual merit and broad impacts. Specifically for GRFP, what does intellectual merit mean? It means your potential to advance knowledge. How have you in the past demonstrated your intellectual abilities? That could be communicated through grades, curricula, awards, etc. Other evidence for your potential, such as the ability to plan and conduct research. Well, there's the research statement. Research is done in teams. Describe, give the reviewers a sense for which type of team member you are. Do you support the team? Do you prefer to work alone, which is probably not the best way to pitch yourself as a researcher, right? You want to demonstrate that you're a team player, right? Mostly, but if necessary, you could do work also alone, but never entirely alone, right? You should be demonstrating that you can interpret and communicate research, that you take initiative, solve problems, etc. The potential of your approach to your field of study and your research plan to advance knowledge are important criteria to assess the intellectual merit of you. And intellectual merit could be really found in any part of your application package: personal statement, research plan, letters, experiences, awards, achievements, and transcripts. Broader impacts. The potential impact of the individual, you, the applicant, on society. And of course, the potential impact of your research on society. Why is it really important? So societal benefits may include, but are not limited to, increasing participation of underrepresented groups that include women, students with disabilities, and veterans and minority. Outreach, mentoring. How have you engaged in peer mentoring activities? How have you helped others? Improving STEM education in schools, increasing public scientific literacy, increasing public engagement in STEM, community outreach, science clubs, radio, TV, newspapers, blogs. All those activities are considered broader impact activities. And as you think about applying for GRFP, make your list, what you have done, and how you could communicate your potential for broader impacts later on. What is your potential to impact a diverse global competitive workforce, right? Have you had some kind of experience working at the intersection between academia and industry? Have you had an internship? All those things could provide some evidence for you being able to have a broader impact as a professional. Again, like intellectual merit, broader impacts can be found in all parts of the application: personal statements, research plan, letters, experiences, awards, and achievements. We touched briefly on personal statements and research statements. But actually, you will receive more information from our wonderful panelists in a minute. Before we move to the panelist part, right, and we hear their stories, I want to share something about letters of references. GRFP letters of reference or recommendations differ from the regular graduate school letter. So whenever you reach out to your reference letter writer, make sure that they are aware of NSF's intellectual merit and broader impact criteria. They should mention intellectual merit and broader impacts if possible, right? Discuss with them, share with them your application material, and have a conversation about why you think you're a good candidate for GRFP. And remind your reference letter writers that GREs are not a part of the application. So there's no need of mentioning the GRE in the reference letter. A strong letter can say things that students wouldn't say about themselves, right? Share that with your reference letter writer. And also, well, you might not want to say directly to your reference letter writer, but that's a good tip for them. They should not overshadow you, the applicant, as they describe the research you propose to do. Quickly, some tips. Start early. Start tonight to look at the most recent solicitation at nsfgrfp.org, right? See tips and the FAQs on the nsfgrfp.org website. They have tons of material there which go way deeper into the material than I could do within this 1 hour, right? Use intellectual merit and broader impact headlines in your statements as outlined in the solicitation. I mentioned that earlier. When you talk about your honors and your experiences and presentations, be very clear what that actually means so the reviewers can understand it. To get a good sense for how clear you are, share all those lists and descriptions with friends, family members, colleagues, maybe with faculty members to get feedback. Feedback is so important. Share all the statements with peers and faculty. Spell check. Nothing is more annoying for a reviewer than reading a document which is full of misspelled words. Embrace formatting guidelines and submit on time. Don't wait till the absolute deadline. Submit at least 2-3 days earlier so you have peace of mind. You don't have to worry if the system breaks down 5 minutes before the actual deadline, and then you might have missed that opportunity to apply. Sketch out your personal GRFP application readiness timeline and add your action items as you do that, right? So between now and late of October, think about when do I have to do what to get ready for the submission of the GRFP application package. And I'm fully aware I could talk for hours, but nothing has more impact than really having the experts here, those experts that really did it. They received the NSF GRFP. And I'm privileged to welcome today 3 wonderful NSF GRFP awardees, Nan Q from the Scripps Research Institute, who received the GRFP in 2021, Raven Malatesta, who is currently at Georgia Tech, and she received the GRFP Fellowship in 2021, this year, and Danielle Maxwell, who received the GRFP in 2020 and is currently working as a graduate student at University of Michigan. And with that, I will actually stop my presentation because we want to make sure that all of our panelists are actually visible. And let me make sure that the presentation is up. Chris, if you could just chat me if everything is all right, that would be good. And in the meantime, I think we could switch to our panel. So thank you for being with us today and sharing your expertise with our audience. And I would like maybe to start with Nan to quickly introduce yourself a little bit more than what I have shared already. You have about 2-3 minutes, and then we will do a quick round of introductions with Raven and Danielle. Nan.
Sure. Thank you, Jorg, for having us here today. My name is Nan, and I am a second-year graduate student at the Scripps Research Institute. I obtained my bachelor's degree from Arizona State University in biochemistry, and I'm currently focusing on the aspect of chemical biology, specifically using mass spec-based technologies to interrogate biological systems. So I was first introduced to the NSF GRFP program by my undergraduate advisor, and he approached me right around the end of junior year, introducing this program to me, and he has served on the reviewers panel for a couple of years and told me that it's a wonderful opportunity. So we decided that we'd give it a try and applied the following fall semester, which was my senior year. I crafted the application together and submitted it. Unfortunately, that year I was not funded. However, they do give feedbacks to all applicants of that year, which really helped me to craft my application in the end of first year in graduate school, which is actually the latest for a graduate student, if without any special circumstances to apply. There I gathered more preliminary data as well as more outreach experience to elaborate as well as to polish my application a little bit better. And with this extra experience and the help of my previous advisor, as well as from the Scripps Research Office of Grants and Fellowships, I was fortunate enough to be funded this time. So for undergraduate students as well as graduate students in the audience today, I have an experience with both rounds of applications, so feel free to ask me anything about these two experiences I had.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan, and welcome. Let's move on to Raven.
Hi, I am Raven Malatesta. I am also a second-year graduate student. I'm at Georgia Tech now. I did my undergrad at Lewis and Clark College, which is a small liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon, and I actually got my BA there in chemistry and economics. But I chose to go on to graduate school in chemistry, and as part of that choice, I applied to NSF the first time. I also applied as an undergraduate, and the feedback that I got really was that I hadn't considered the broader impacts of my project enough, which I think was fair. I fully understood that. And going into graduate school, my PI that I committed to asked me the summer before I started whether I would be writing an application in the fall. And I told him that I didn't think that I should write it in my first year because I didn't feel confident that I fully understood my project. And I was going to wait and write it my second year. And the research that I wrote about in my proposal is actually what I'm doing research on now. It's on developing a new form of spectroscopy using polarization entangled photon pairs as a probe. So we now treat the light matter interaction of spectroscopy fully quantum mechanically instead of just considering the electromagnetic waves classically. I think this comes out a little bit in what I just said, but my biggest piece of advice about applying, particularly if you're a graduate student, if you're an incoming graduate student, it's likely that you'll hear you should apply as a first year because in reviewing applications, people take into consideration whether you're a first year graduate student or a second year graduate student. And with that, being a first year graduate student will come with lower expectations. They know that you're newer to the topic. that's not always the right way to go. For me, it was the right thing to do to wait, and I'm very glad I did.
Thank you for sharing, Raven. This is really very helpful to the audience. And let's move to Danielle. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. My name is Danielle. I am also a second-year graduate student, the Department of Chemistry at the University of Michigan. I am also pursuing a master's in post-secondary science education at the University of Michigan as well. I received my bachelor's degree from the University of Detroit Mercy in 2019. It's a small liberal arts college in Detroit, Michigan, rooted in Jesuit and Mercy traditions. So when I came to the University of Michigan, I started in the summer, which is a little bit different. Some schools offer a summer rotation, some schools do not, but mine did. So I started in early June, and I got a little bit of a touch of research as to what chemistry education research is. In undergrad, I strictly did analytical research, and so going into graduate school in an entirely new field was challenging and at first very scary. So having that summer to kind of get my feet wet, learn a little bit about chemistry education research really helped me prepare to apply. And unlike the other two panelists, I applied during my first year and my first year only, which was very challenging, balancing classes and teaching, research, and on top of this, writing an application for the NSF GRFP. But over the course of the early part of the semester, through my contacts that I had with my research group, former mentors, peers and whatnot, I was able to craft a statement, my research statement and a personal statement that I was proud of, and I felt comfortable submitting it my first year. That's not the right path for everyone, and I'd be happy to talk about what it's like submitting an application in your first year and how that might set you a little bit apart or also might make it a little bit more challenging. Most of my friends applied a second year, so when I was applying, I didn't have that support of the people in my cohort as they were all going through it together, and I kind of did it with one other person in my first year.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing, Danielle. What I really love about your introductions, it becomes very clear there is no standard way how you could successfully apply for a GRFP. It's always tied to your unique environment, to your unique experiences and where you are in terms of your readiness to apply. So I'm wondering if you are if you could share something about how you approached actually the writing of the personal statement, which is a 3-page document, which is really carrying a lot of weight as reviewers look at GRFP application. So any considerations what our audience should take into consideration in terms of how you have approached writing of that statement? And let's start maybe the other way around. Danielle.
Sure. So I personally have a hard time writing about myself. It's a very big challenge for me to think about myself and portray what I've done and what I would like to do in a way that I am proud of, but it doesn't sound like I'm coming off as egotistical. So that's always been a balance for me, is trying to figure out how to craft that statement. And so something that helped me as I was crafting this personal statement was to write out everything that I've done in undergrad and early graduate school and kind of just make a list and see where are these connections. So in undergrad, I was heavily involved in science outreach, and how was I connecting that into graduate school, and how does that connect to the broader impacts of my research? So finding that common thread really did help me craft my personal statement and kind of create that story as to what interests me about science, what got me interested in chemistry education research. Another thing that helped me was thinking about myself as a separate person. So if I was writing this for someone else and this is what they gave me on their resume, that really helped me to kind of just like distinguish this as, this is Danielle's application. It's not mine. Let's write it for someone else. And that was really helpful for me to kind of narrow down on what was most important to the statement, because you only have 3 pages. It sounds like a lot, but it's really short amount of space.
I like the idea of detaching yourself from that statement and looking as a reviewer or someone who writes about a different person. That is certainly very, very helpful. Raven.
Yeah, so I'm battling a cat, so you might see a cat in the screen. But I was very fortunate the second time I was writing an application that my department offered a proposal writing workshop. So I wrote my NSF application as part of that workshop. And one of the things that came out really early on in the workshop when we were looking through our first drafts was there's a tendency to write the personal statement for NSF as you are writing the personal statement for a graduate school application. It can come off a lot like a graduate school application personal statement. And if that's true of your application, you want to really reconsider it. I focused originally on writing basically the timeline of everything I did in one cohesive story rather than looking for what was the overall message that I was personally motivated by. And because of that, the first time I got feedback from people in the workshop, the person who was reading my personal statement only made it through 3/4 of the first page and said, "Sorry, I stopped reading," which was very harsh. At the time, I was very taken aback by it, but I realized what that reviewer was trying to communicate to me is you need to establish the point you're making as an applicant from the very start. You don't want to slowly pull them into your story. You want to let them know right away you're an interesting applicant and this is how you fit NSF's criteria. So I took a somewhat brash approach to that of on both my personal statement and my graduate statement. At the very start of my statement, I had one sentence italicized that was the overall point of what I was trying to do. It made it very clear on both research and personal, okay, this is what we're talking about. Now we can get into the nitty-gritty about it instead of a slow rolling introduction.
Excellent. Thank you. Just on a side note, be aware the reviewers very likely will not take time off or take vacation and start reviewing GRFP applications at 8 a.m. in the morning and consider that a full-time job. They're very likely reviewing that after work, after the kids may be in bed. So as you write those statements, make sure that you are upfront with the message you would like to convey. Be as clear as possible. That is very important. I think, Raven, what you just said makes that point really beautifully. Nan, what would you share with the audience in terms of writing a personal statement?
I definitely benefited from the message of Raven, and I'd like to ditto that. But to make one point further is that I had a similar story of crafting a personal statement, sent it to a group of supportive fellows that previously got awarded, and their major feedback was it all sounds like a fantastic personal story, but what is your intellectual merit and what is your broader impact? You know, the reviewers are going to be asked to fill out an evaluation form, and probably the top two questions are what are the intellectual merit and broader impact of this applicant. So don't be hesitant to explicitly write out that my intellectual merits consist 1, 2, 3. This project or being funded by GRFP will have broader societal impacts, including 1, 2, 3, and highlight these sentences because when they glance over your application, they can see that clearly and they know what to look for in the rest of the statement. So that is really the biggest thing that I benefited from this entire interaction with our previous fellows, and I'd like to share that with all of you today.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Nan. Let's switch the topic from the personal statement to the research statement. There's certainly some things you would like to share with the students considering applying for GRFP. What tips do you have for finding a topic for a research statement? How to really make sure that your research statement in the best possible shape? With whom have you shared the research statement to receive feedback, right? We heard already several times receiving feedback throughout the process, super critical, right? So anything what you would like to share in that space would be very much appreciated. And let's start maybe now with Raven.
Sure. So I think the most important thing that I ran into in preparing my application after sharing it with a number of different professors who were adjacent to what I was doing was you should be cautious of being over technical in your language. So you are submitting your application to reviewers who are in this subcategory of most likely chemistry. But these reviewers are going to have specialties all over the place. So for me in particular, I was writing an application that had a lot of pretty hefty quantum mechanics language in it. And the first time I shared it with another physical chemistry professor, he said, "There's too much jargon. I don't know what's going on." It can be tempting to fall back on jargon, particularly because it can lure you into thinking you sound very knowledgeable because you're using these really complex terms, but just using jargon rather than explaining it simply doesn't communicate that you have a good understanding of your project. So one of the really positive parts of feedback I got from my reviewers this time around when I was awarded NSF was that my research statement specifically showed that I had a good understanding of my project. It was explained clearly. So making sure you're not overcomplicating things just to sound impressive, and a sort of small side note to that is avoid using too many acronyms. If you're defining an acronym every other sentence, someone who's not in your specific subfield is going to completely lose track of what you're saying across several sentences.
Wonderful. And even if someone is in a specific subfield, it is so unlikely that the specialist on that topic you want to work on is actually the reviewer of your research statement. So think about, okay, if you propose something in chemical catalysis, someone with a broad knowledge in chemical catalysis should understand what you write, right? So be broad. And again, reviewers do not read those applications during the day. It's very late at night. So keep it light and concise and digestible for reviewers. So wonderful recommendation, Raven. Let's go to Nan now, the research statement.
Yes, so a personal challenge in crafting the research statement for me was actually incorporating broader impacts into my research plan. And this was heavily criticized in my previous application that, the applicant highlighted the potential to broaden the knowledge for the scientific field, but what does it mean for the bigger audience, the general public? So in this case, I, of course, started early and talked to a diverse group of professors as well as my peers to gauge whether this proposed project can be either extended to incorporate any outreach activities or the project itself, having solved this problem, could impact the society, whether in a educational way or just broadening people's understanding, the general public's understanding of a disease relevant phenotype. So I think starting to think about that very, very early on, and also discussing that with your advisor or people who had experience in NSF is extremely important, because this is essentially, I think, what set my application apart from the rest of the pool is there were strong broader impacts even in the proposal. So I urge you to think about that early and to gather as much information as possible.
Thank you so much, Nan. And Danielle, as you answer or give some recommendations for the research statement, I would like to fold in a question from the audience. And as you reflect on how you crafted the research statement, if you could share something about references and the importance of references as you crafted your research statement, that would be great.
Sure. I will start off with that first, so I don't forget the question. So when I went to find people that would like to have them write me a letter of recommendation, I thought about where I currently was and where I came from. So I think you're allowed to have up to 5, though 2 is a minimum and 3 is recommended. I started off with 3, and so I chose my undergraduate research advisor because I was working with her for 4 years, and so she could definitely talk about my research experience and development as a researcher through undergrad. I also chose my undergraduate academic advisor, who was also the student chapter advisor of the chemistry club that I was heavily involved in, so he could kind of attribute to my intellectual merit as well as my broader impacts. And I chose my research advisor at the University of Michigan. I also had a backup, which she ended up writing a letter in time, and so I had another research professor at the University of Michigan that I was working closely with on this project submit a letter. So in the end, I had 4 letters, 2 from undergrad and 2 from the University of Michigan. So it was a nice balance between the past and the current to the future. So that was for the reference letters. Regarding my research statement, how I came to the topic was after I did my summer rotation, I kind of had an idea about what I was passionate about in chemistry education. There are so many pathways you can take in chemistry education. You can go quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. So I kind of narrowed it down to qualitative and talked about the project I was working on, what I was excited about with that project, and how I wanted to expand upon that. And I talked about that with my research advisor, graduate student mentor, and other people in my research group to kind of say like, hey, does this idea make sense? Like, what if I did this? Does this fit? And kind of just talking through my ideas really helped me narrow down, like, what do I need to focus on in this research statement? What is the bare minimum that I need to include? It's only 2 pages. So you do not have a ton of room at all. And so after talking through these ideas with my research group, I kind of outlined something, gave it to them and said, here's a very rough outline. Please point out like what I need to elaborate, what can be removed. And we kind of went through that iterative process a few times. Eventually, I got to a statement I liked. And at the bottom, I outlined a paragraph called broader impacts and then intellectual merit right at the bottom as well. So it was very clear how my research was contributing to those 2 factors. Something I found challenging about the research statement was that I wanted to include a figure, and a figure takes up a lot of space when you only have 2 pages. So while they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, you might want to try to find a way to word that figure if you can. It'll save you a ton of room.
Wonderful advice. Thank you so much, Danielle. But again, it becomes very clear. Make it very clear and easy for the reviewer to extract the important information they are looking for, intellectual merit and broader impacts. So getting back to the references and the research statement, so there are also references, literature references, right? So how many references did you use, and are they included in the page limit? Raven, actually, that question was associated with one of your statements earlier. You want to address it?
Choosing references was quite a challenge for me because the references are a part of your page limit. The research statement is even shorter than the personal statement, and even that is really short. So I stuck with as few references as I possibly could, which was 5, and also figured out the shortest way I could possibly still appropriately cite them. You do have to be very selective on these references, but because the reviewers that are looking at your application, if they're interested in your application, they will go and look at those references. So I specifically, one of the things I focused on in choosing my references was avoiding any large review articles. If you are trying to cite something that's the general state of the field, maybe use a specific example instead of citing a 30-page long review article. Bring up specific and strong references and be selective.
Excellent, great advice. So before we move to the last topic cluster, again, reference letters, and I would like to hear from Raven and Nan, and also from Danielle, some additional thoughts about who did you choose, and how did you communicate, and when did you communicate with your reference letter writers? But before we go there, I would like to take the opportunity to answer some questions from the audience. The first one is, what is the advantage of submitting an application early? There's no advantage. There's one deadline. However, if you submit 1 or 2 days before, that guarantees that the system is not overloaded and that your application is actually in by the deadline. If you submit, or let's say if your application is received a second, half a second, a quarter of a second after the deadline, it will not be reviewed. And that is heartbreaking because you will spend a lot of time crafting those applications. So submitting 1, 2, 3 days before is a great idea, but there's no advantage in the review process. Then one question about what happens if I get funding for 5 years but finish my degree sooner than that. So it's a 5-year award, which includes 3 years of funding from the National Science Foundation. And you have to tell NSF, oh, I will use my NSF GRFP in year 1, 3, and 5. If you have a more condensed timeline and you know you will graduate after 3 years, use all the funds in the first 3 years. So that would be one recommendation. And without further ado, let's pivot again to the references, and we might start with Nan. So who did you choose? How did you communicate with your reference letter writers?
Sure. I ended up submitting 3 letters. One was from my undergraduate research advisor who I published a paper with. So that's definitely one person to include if you published a paper with somebody. And I also chose my current research advisor who can speak about my ability to do research as well as outreach, since he is also involved in several clubs as well as outreach programs that I'm heavily involved in. So that was my way to pivot both research or academic merit and outreach, broader societal impact, and my potential in fulfilling both 2 criteria. And the last reference letter, I chose a professor, a teaching professor at Scripps, who was also one of the mentors for our Women in Science outreach program. So this is also from a perspective of one academic professor as well as outreach coordinator, peer mentor kind of perspective. And how I communicated with them is I started off telling very early on that I'd like to apply for this. Do you think you can support me? And this went as early as in August, so 2 months before the submission deadline. And luckily, they were all three of them are very supportive, and they would explicitly ask, please send me your CV, your like things you have done, or when you have your statements ready, please let me look over it. And if your reference letters do not ask for that, offer them. Please offer them, and make sure that they know what you wrote in there so they can elaborate on parts that perhaps you didn't cover as much. So that was my experience with references.
Super, thank you so much. Raven, anything to share?
Sure. Along with that, I also had my undergraduate research advisor as a reference, as well as my current research advisor. And originally, I had a lot of ideas about who I wanted to write my third and then maybe fourth and fifth letter. I even considered choosing to have my economics major advisor write a letter because I knew he would write a strong letter for me as a student and as a researcher, and ended up deciding not to do that because I made the choice on who my third reference writer would be based on what hole my application still had in it. So one of the things that I struggled with the most was just packing everything into my research statement because it was so short. And one of the holes that I felt it had was showing what is the importance of this research and showing that this somewhat crazy thing I was proposing would actually work. So I selected my third reference to be someone who is in physical chemistry with experience in spectroscopy. And when I asked him to write a reference letter for me, I also asked him specifically to highlight that my proposed research was feasible, using his own cred as being knowledgeable of the field. And I also just want to second Nan with make sure you ask your reference writers early. I sent my entire application, I sent probably the second or third draft when I had a full application written to all of my reference writers. I asked them also in August to make sure they would have time to prepare things. And then a somewhat sillier piece of advice is don't be afraid to nag them. Generally, reference writers are really busy with things that are much more important than a one-page reference letter, so they're going to forget about it. And I've never had anyone call me out on sending multiple annoying emails all the time. And even with that, I ended up having one of my reference writers not submitting the letter until a half hour before the reference letter deadline, which is very stressful, especially after working months and months on this application and you have no control over it. So ask them, you can ask them to get it early if you can. Don't be afraid to nag them about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Raven. Danielle, do you want to add anything regarding the reference letters? I know you shared already a couple of insights earlier.
I don't have much to add. I just like to second everything that Raven and Nan said. Getting started early is definitely the best bet. When the GRFP application rolls around, the semester is starting. So usually contacting your reference writers in early to mid-August is your best bet, just so that it's on their radar before the school semester begins. The nice thing about the GRFP website is that after you submit, you have this dashboard where you can see if your reference letter writer submitted their letter. So I found myself checking that daily as the deadline got closer. multiple times a day to see if they submitted it, which was good to see. If they emailed me and they're like, hey, I submitted it, I could go on the GRFP website and be like, yes, GRFP got it. One less thing to worry about. So that is one good thing about the website for sure.
Excellent. I want to be mindful of the time. We got still a lot of questions, but I think we touched on the most important topic areas quite a bit. So if there are other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly, j_schlatter@acs.org or grad@acs.org. I'm happy to follow up with questions which were not answered so far. One of the most important things which I would like to re-emphasize, and we heard it from Raven, we heard it from Nan, we heard it from Danielle, start early, cultivate relationships with the letter writers, read the solicitation, which includes not only information about the personal statement and the research statement, but also technical things about font size and all those things which could disqualify you if you don't acknowledge that, right? So there's no point in giving you any money if you can't follow instructions, right? So NSF really pays attention to those technical details. So download the solicitation, read it over and over, and make sure that you really embrace everything what is in that document. And with that, we're already a little bit over time. A big thank you to our wonderful panelists today, Raven Malatesta, Nan Q, and Danielle Maxwell. Thank you so much for joining today. And it was a pleasure listening to your insights and being able to share your wisdom with the whole audience via this webinar. We recorded the webinar and we will put the webinar online in case someone would like to go back and revisit what you have shared with them. So a big thank you to you. A big thank you to our audience. Thank you for joining and good luck with the GRFP application. All have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.